The silent keys. The morning mist hung low over Riverside Park as David Carter sat on his usual bench, watching the city wake up around him. His worn green army jacket, faded from years of wear, provided little protection against the October chill. Beside him lay a weathered cardboard sign with careful handwriting, "Homeless Veteran." "Anything helps. God bless." David's fingers traced invisible patterns on his knees, moving in ways that seemed almost musical. To passing joggers and dog walkers, it might have looked like nervous fidgeting. But David was playing piano, the way he had done every morning for the past 3 years. Silent piano on invisible keys, muscle memory keeping alive what his circumstances had taken away. The park bench faced the back entrance of Melody's Music Academy, a prestigious school where wealthy parents dropped off their children for private lessons. Through the tall windows, David could see the grand pianos, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning light. Sometimes, when the wind was just right and a window was open, he could catch fragments of scales and etudes drifting across the courtyard. A steady stream of people passed by on their way to work. Most avoided eye contact, hurrying past with their coffee cups and busy thoughts. David understood. He had been like them once, focused on deadlines and meetings, too preoccupied to notice the invisible people who lived on the margins. Around 10:30, a group of teenagers approached from the direction of the nearby private high school. Their designer backpacks and expensive phones marked them as students from families that never worried about their next meal. They walked with the confident swagger that comes from never having faced real hardship. "Look at this loser," one of them said loudly. The speaker was a tall boy, with perfectly styled hair and designer sneakers that probably cost more than David spent on food in a month. Just sitting there doing nothing all day. David kept his gaze down, focusing on the fallen leaves scattered around his feet. Yellow and orange maple leaves, still holding traces of their summer beauty. He had learned long ago that responding to taunts only made things worse. The group stopped near his bench, clearly looking for entertainment. A girl with long blonde hair and expensive jewelry laughed mockingly. "My dad says people like him are just too lazy to work. Why should we give them money when they won't even try?" "Hey, old man," the first boy called out directly to David. "What's your excuse? Why don't you get a real job like everyone else?" David looked up slowly, meeting the teenager's eyes with a steady gaze that held no anger, only sadness. "I have skills," he said quietly, his voice carrying the careful dignity of someone who had learned to protect what remained of his self-respect. This brought delighted laughter from the group. "Skills!" the blonde girl exclaimed. "Like what, professional panhandling?" "I can play piano," David said simply. The teenagers erupted in cruel laughter. "Piano!" the tall boy shouted. "Oh man, that's hilarious. What are you gonna do, play us a concert?" "Maybe he thinks he's some kind of Mozart," another student added, pulling out his phone to record what he expected would be an amusing spectacle. Their laughter echoed across the quiet park, harsh and mocking. David felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but also something else stirring deep inside him. He looked toward the music academy, where he could see a beautiful grand piano through one of the large windows. "Can I play it for food?" David asked, nodding toward the building. This brought another wave of hysterical laughter. "This is perfect," the first student said, his phone already recording. "Homeless guy thinks he's a concert pianist. This is going viral for sure." At that moment, Margaret Harrison emerged from the Music Academy's back door. She was an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind stylish glasses. Margaret had directed the academy for 25 years, and something about the scene unfolding in the park caught her attention. "What's going on out here?" Margaret asked. Though her tone suggested she had overheard enough to understand the situation, the teenagers eagerly explained their discovery, pointing at David and barely containing their amusement. "He claims he can play piano," one of them said between giggles. "We're just having some fun with him." Margaret studied David carefully. There was something about the way he held his hands, the unconscious finger movements, the reverent way he looked at the piano visible through the academy windows. As a lifelong musician, she recognized the subtle signs. "Would you like to come inside?" Margaret asked David gently. The teenagers fell silent, surprised by this unexpected development. David hesitated, suddenly aware of his appearance, his rumpled clothes, the way he must look to someone as refined as Margaret. "Music welcomes everyone," Margaret said softly, understanding his reluctance. David stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours on the cold bench. He followed Margaret toward the academy, the teenagers trailing behind with their phones ready to capture what they assumed would be an embarrassing failure. The interior of the academy was warm and elegant. The walls were lined with photographs of famous musicians and former students who had gone on to successful careers. The air smelled of wood polish and the lingering traces of rosin from violin bows. But David's attention was drawn immediately to the magnificent concert grand piano that dominated the main studio. "Please," Margaret said, gesturing toward the piano bench. David approached the instrument with reverence. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the fallboard, revealing the keys he had dreamed about every night for 3 long years. He sat down, adjusted the bench height with instinctive precision, and placed his fingers gently on the keys. For a moment, he simply sat there, feeling the familiar weight of the keys beneath his touch. Then, slowly, he began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the studio with impossible beauty. David's hands moved across the keys with extraordinary grace and power, each note precise and filled with profound emotion. The years of loss, of struggle, of sleeping in doorways and eating from garbage cans all poured out through the music in waves of heartbreaking magnificence. The mocking laughter died instantly. The teenagers stood frozen, their phones forgotten in their trembling hands. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she recognized not just exceptional technical skill, but the heart of a true artist. David played with his eyes closed, completely lost in the music that had always been his truest voice. Despite years away from a real piano, his technique remained flawless. More than that, his interpretation was profound, filled with the wisdom that comes only from having lived through genuine suffering. When the last note faded into silence, the studio remained perfectly still. David opened his eyes and stared at his hands on the keys, as if surprised to find them capable of such beauty. "Extraordinary," Margaret whispered. "Absolutely extraordinary." The teenagers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their cruelty settling heavily in the room. The tall boy who had been most vocal cleared his throat awkwardly. We're really sorry," he stammered. "We had no idea." David turned to face them, his expression holding no anger, only infinite sadness. "You had no idea because you chose not to see," he said quietly. "You saw what you wanted to see." Margaret stepped forward. "Where did you train?" "Curtis Institute," David replied. "I had a promising career until—" He paused, the weight of his story too complex for simple explanation. "Until I came back from Afghanistan changed. PTSD?" Margaret asked with gentle understanding. David nodded. "Some battles continue long after the war ends." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been looking for someone to teach our advanced students. Someone who understands that real music comes from real experience." The question hung in the air like the last note of a beautiful song. David looked around the academy, at the instruments waiting to make music, at Margaret's compassionate face, at the students who now saw him as a human being with infinite worth. "I would be honored," David said, his voice thick with emotion. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, David played one more piece. A gentle composition of his own creation, born from years of silence and longing. The music filled the academy with hope, proving that the most beautiful melodies often come from the deepest places of the human soul. The teenagers left quietly, forever changed by what they had witnessed. Margaret began planning David's teaching schedule, and David Carter, veteran, survivor, and master pianist, began his journey home to the music that had never truly abandoned him.